with U.S. Congressman Thomas Massie from Kentucky's 4th District. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Tom. I recognize the song you played as the lead-in. Was that "Don't Get Me Down"?
Yeah, don't bring me down. Yeah,
I'm sorry. I might bring your listeners down after they hear what I have to say today.
Yeah, it's pretty scary stuff. And I heard you on Glenn Beck yesterday talking about food shortages, and unprecedented actions are going to bring about unprecedented results and unintended consequences here shortly.
Yeah, and that's because you have people running the government that have no clue about how the economy works and how their food gets to the table. Let me just summarize some of the stuff I said on Glenn Beck and a little bit more, because I've got even more information since I was on Glenn Beck yesterday. Yesterday, I was on a conference call with the Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, and several other congressmen from agricultural states. And this is heating up. Here's what's happening. The price of beef and pork is going up in the supermarket. The frozen reserves of that are going down. And the shocking thing, but it's not shocking if you know how the food supply works, the shocking thing is that farmers are watching the value of their hogs and steers and cows go down. In fact, they're going to some of the lowest levels ever. So the question is, why is the price of meat going up in the supermarket and the price of cattle going down at the auction ring? It's because our supply line is brittle. You have to take a cattle, a steer or beef, whatever, or a hog, to a processing plant. And these processing plants, like much of industrial America right now, are shutting down because of absentees, which has been exacerbated by the unemployment program that the federal government has instituted, plus the $1,200 checks that are about to hit, plus some of the regulations that the states have put in place, the governors. So what's happening, Tom, is there are at least 6 giant meat processing plants that are just shut down. They're in Iowa, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and one of these places processes 1,900 cattle a day, just to give you an idea of what we're grappling with here. And so 1,900 cattle a day that were going into the U.S. food supply or not going into the U.S. food supply, that just represents one of these processing plants. Mm. And what I'm telling people, and Tom, I hope I am wrong, and I hope the conditions that I'm going to describe don't happen. But if we don't change policy, I'm afraid they are going to happen. Mm. I think you're going to see farmers go bankrupt. I think you're going to see shortages at the supermarket. And worst of all, these videos you've seen of milk being poured out at the dairies. Yeah. It's one thing to see the milk poured out. It's another thing when I'm afraid you're going to eventually see this, YouTubes of cattle and hogs being euthanized and incinerated or buried while we have shortages in the supermarket. And you talk about civil unrest when people start seeing that, and it's all because of our brittle food supply, our supply chain. And I have been working on this since I got to Congress. I've got a bill. I sent this to the USDA yesterday. I talked about it on the conference call with the other members of Congress. I've got a bill that would let these local meat packers sell cuts of meat individually instead of having to sell you half a cow or a quarter of a cow, which in these times most people are not going to be able to afford. They don't have the freezer space. The appliances aren't getting manufactured. You're not going to be able to go out and buy a freezer here in a month or two. They will have sold all the supply. So anyways, what my bill is, it's called the Prime Act. I've talked about it on your show before. It has Republican and Democrat sponsors. There's a Senate version that has a Democrat and 2 Republicans on it in the Senate. And that's the kind of thing that we need right now. I also have been urging the Secretary of Agriculture to make an administrative change on that half or quarter of a cow or hog that you're allowed to sell if you use a local processor. I'm saying, you know what? we don't even need to pass my bill because so much of this regulation is administrative rule, and the president or even the Secretary of Agriculture could just issue a ruling that says, you know what, the loophole that lets you sell a half or a quarter of an animal through a local processor, we're going to open that up so you can sell cuts of meat through that local processor at a grocery store, which is what we need to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one other final thing about what we're grappling with here in the food supply chain, the dairies, the reason you see them pouring out milk, it's not because there's not demand for milk in the supermarket. The demand has doubled in the supermarket. The problem is half the supply chain was geared to supply school lunches and restaurants, mm-hmm. where they get the cheese not labeled individually with the calories on it, but in a big tote, mm-hmm. right? And those outlets aren't there anymore. Nobody in the dairy industry is going to buy more equipment to blow mold, the gallon jugs and the other types of containers that you get in the supermarket, or to package more cheese. In fact, they're having a hard time getting the labor to show up to even to run the machines that they do have, but they're not going to buy new machines. So just tying this all together, when dairies are losing money on milk, for a while they can pour out the milk, but eventually they sell the cows into the beef market, which is going to further depress if you're a beef farmer, that's going to further depress the price that you see at the sale ring, mm-hmm. because that market's going to be flooded with the dairy cows, which those dairies, they'll sell those cows at any price. There's no low number on that. There's no bottom on that because they have to get rid of them. They can't afford to feed them and pour out the milk. Mm-hmm. So this is the picture that I'm painting. It is serious. I used the word civil unrest in our conference call yesterday with the ag secretary and with my other congressman, because I just don't think they understand what is coming, and it's coming quicker than you think. I would say 4 weeks away. So I'm trying to get people's attention to deal with this issue. I also heard on the conference call from other congressmen that some farmers are plowing under crops or pulling up crops because they weren't going to have the labor to harvest them. And so it doesn't make sense to go ahead and, spend all the effort and money in growing crops that will never be harvested. And the conference call, the problem is my colleagues are talking about how to write checks to farmers to keep the farmers whole. You can write all the checks you want. It doesn't make food show up on a table.
Right.
And this is what I'm trying to tell them. And then they're saying, well, one of my colleagues says, asked the USDA, what's your emergency plan? If, when all the meat packers eventually shut down, or let's say if 70% of them shut down, and they didn't really have an emergency plan. So what I urged on the call and then later in an email was that we need to have some kind of on-farm processing. There are these mobile processors that have like tractor trailers that have the refrigeration unit and a place to butcher the animal. Mm-hmm. I think we need to, just like these FEMA trailers, we need some trailers, which the FEMA trailers don't typically work out. But we need something like that, a mobilization of an ability to process this food and to get it to stores. Because, and I know you wanted to talk about models too, Tom, but the models are all predicated on everybody staying home. As soon as you lift the mitigation phase, which is what Dr. Fauci calls it, you're going to see this disease, this virus flare back up because we haven't reached a level of herd immunity. Until 30% of the population has been exposed to this, it's going to spread like it was spreading before the mitigation efforts.
They're treating COVID-19 as if it was a tornado. We had some pretty high winds, maybe even had a tornado touchdown the other night here in our area. Like you hunker down until that thing passes, and then you can come out. You can't deal with a virus like that. And I've read from a very well-esteemed epidemiologist who says just what you said, herd immunity is what we need. And, we're not going to see that because when people come back out, guess what? The virus is still there.
Yeah, exactly. And I've asked questions of Dr. Fauci on conference calls, not got satisfying answers, really.
Yeah.
We need to be having hearings about this. Chip Roy, he's a congressman from Texas. He penned a letter, and I co-signed it, asking for hearings about the models that they're using. We need everybody that's got a model that the president and these governors are relying on needs to be called in front of Congress, and we need to be asking questions about their models.
Yeah.
Because here's what the epidemiologists who have the governor's ears right now, they've got us in airport mode. Have you ever been to an airport where they delay your flight 15 minutes?
Yeah.
And then you kind of sort of know, because they haven't told you why it was delayed, that in an hour they're going to tell you it's another hour delay.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2 hours after that, they're going to tell you it got delayed again. And they're not sharing the information with you. I know everybody that's ever flown has been in that situation before. They've got the whole country in airport mode. In other words, just trust us. It's a delay. We'll let you know when we get to the next delay how long the next delay is. That's not acceptable. People need to know when, or if not when, under what conditions will the governors release us from our homes and let us go to work.
Yeah. We're talking with Congressman Massie from Kentucky District 4. Going back to the possible food shortages here, what's the inevitable outcome when the American people can't get a hold of food? What are we going to see? Rioting in the streets, civil unrest, people's homes being invaded?
Yeah, it's a dark picture. And the only reason I want to go into this, I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I hope later in a year somebody can play this back and say, look, Massie was an alarmist, blah, blah, blah. Well, if it turns out that I'm an alarmist and it gets people's attention and they switch course and then I end up being wrong, then I'm happy for it, okay? But here's what happens if we don't change course, and this is because of the food supply. Neighbors you're going to have people who've never committed a crime in their lives, when their kids are going hungry and they can't buy it in the grocery store, they're going to rationalize in their mind taking it from a neighbor. And when you have neighbors taking it from neighbors, and the way they'll rationalize it is, well, my neighbor hoarded all that stuff, and that wasn't right, so he committed the sin, and so what I'm doing by taking his stuff is justified. So I'm afraid when you see shortages, hopefully the kindness of the American people doesn't get to that. I know in my community people will share, but eventually people will start prioritizing, and their patience will wear thin. So when you have neighbors who are taking stuff from other neighbors, otherwise law-abiding citizens, God-fearing citizens, right, driven to do this, then the people who were going to the work, the 50% of the country who was still employed, realizes that they have to stay home to protect their stuff and their family. And then the whole thing grinds to a halt, like sand, being poured into the gears. And I'm just painting that picture of what could happen if we don't get back to rational policy. We've got to put this country back to work. People, the government, they started out with the lie that face masks don't work. Mm-hmm. And that's when I went on Twitter and I put a camera. I found a live camera of a busy street in Tokyo, and where you can go there and watch. I need to go check it out today. And it's Japanese people going on about their lives with masks on. 30 or 40% of them are wearing masks. Mm-hmm. And that's, that masks. And, in the beginning, the government said masks don't help you. Mm-hmm. And then now they're coming around to the truth. And also in the beginning, they said, we don't want everybody tested. Tom, what we want is a $10 test that everybody can take every morning when they show up at work, and the employer would gladly pay for it, and to know whether that person needs to go back home or to go to work.
Right. And
instead of locking down everybody, and instead of turning everybody into prisoners in their own houses, we need to advise only the people who are sick or carrying the virus to stay home.
Yeah. We don't need to treat Wayne County, West Virginia, Boyd County, Kentucky like New York City.
No, this is not a one-size-fits-all, but it's a game of one-upsmanship between the governors. One of a doctor friend of mine, cardiologist, he's a very intelligent person, and I call him up to ask him about the health issues of this virus because he's working at a hospital. He said these governors are like the guys that get together to play poker, penny poker, over at some guy's house, and they end up with the titles to their houses, the deeds to their houses on the table before the night's over in the poker game. Like they've just escalated the stakes.
Yeah.
And here's where the federal government comes into play as exacerbating this. There were some governors that held out, like Ron DeSantis in Florida. He's a friend of mine. Mm-hmm. Know him very well because we served together in Congress, and we worked on a lot of the same issues. And he's a true conservative. He held out. He wasn't doing all the crazy stuff that these other governors are doing. And then the day after we passed this so-called stimulus bill, the $2 trillion stimulus bill, he had to fold under because and this is what I said would happen. We are encouraging the governors who shut down their own economies to keep their own economies shut down, and the ones who haven't shut it down, we've basically given them no choice at that point when we passed this bill. And now they're talking about another bill, and I caught a lot of heck on the first bill just for, I got in a car and I drove to Congress and they said, you can't pass the biggest bill in human history without members of Congress present. It's unconstitutional. It's also unwise. There's no accountability. This bill hasn't been debated. And I forced at least half of Congress, because the Constitution requires it, to come to Congress.
Yep.
Now, a lot of them still today are upset with me.
Sure.
Now, there are a lot of them that agree with me that won't say anything because they saw the beating that I took.
Right.
But I'm willing to take that beating again. But here's what I've proposed to the congressmen who say that, on one hand, they'll say, well, the truckers need to keep working and the nurses need to keep working and the grocery store baggers need to keep working. But, the congressman shouldn't keep working. That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's an unacceptable answer. And so what I've said is, look, if you don't want to come to work, tell Nancy Pelosi to enable remote voting. Now, this isn't like mail-in voting, which the Democrats love because they harvest ballots. When you're a congressman, your vote is public knowledge.
Right.
So it's easy because it's not an anonymous vote, although they like to have some anonymous votes every now and then. This is why they don't want to do the remote voting.
Right.
It's easy to verify that you actually took that vote if you're in Congress because these aren't secret ballots. And but she won't do it. Here's 3 reasons Nancy Pelosi won't do remote voting.
Okay.
Number one, she can't twist your arm over the phone. She doesn't know how to control the votes remotely. They walk up to you on the floor of the House and whisper stuff in your ear about your next election, and that's how they get you to flip your votes. You can't do that on the phone. Number 2, when you walk on the floor of the House, your staff isn't allowed on the floor of the House, but Nancy Pelosi's staff is. So they bamboozle a lot of congressmen. Well, if you had remote voting, you could have your staff right next to you telling you what's in the bill while you're voting.
Right.
And then finally, if you have remote voting, there's no excuse to do a voice vote, to do a unanimous consent. If it's as easy as pressing *1 on a dedicated telephone line, why would you ever have a voice vote? So those are the reasons that Nancy Pelosi doesn't want to do it.
Stand up for that, and let's get these votes recorded to where we know where each representative stands. U.S. Representative Thomas Massie, we know where he stands. Sir, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Tom. I stand with the Constitution and the people of Kentucky's 4th District.
Amen.